Today's Columbus Metropolitan Club Fueling Ohio's Future Forum, Fuel Cells Revolutionize the Energy Economy. Did we have to make that so illiterate? Has several corporate supporters. This series is sponsored by AEP, Battelle, and Columbia Gas, supporting the series, and this forum is supported by my law firm, Porter Wright. And our partner for the series is OSU Office of Energy and Environment. Please join me in thanking all of them. Information about each of our speakers is in your forum flyer, so I'll only give you brief introductions. Our first speaker today is Director of Distribution Devices Support for AEP. Please welcome Ram Sastry. Our next speaker is the Director of the OSU Center for Automotive Research. Please welcome Giorgio Rizzoni. Also joining the panel is a technology consultant for complex energy solutions, John Schneider. And serving as our host today is the Executive Director of Ohio Fuel Cell Corridor, Pat Valente. Those are our speakers. Pat, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rich. I want to give everybody a little bit of background on the Ohio Fuel Cell Coalition. We are the largest fuel cell trade association in the U.S. With over 80 members. In the Columbus area alone, we have Battelle, Ohio State University, Honda, AEP, Nextech Materials, the City of Dublin, and many others. And we have somebody from as far away as Stark Counties. The Stark Area Regional Transit Authority is here. So I'm very pleased to say that we have, we're representative in the region and throughout the state. In the past couple of years, we have seen the fuel cell industry in the state of Ohio be a significant force and in many different aspects. We are one of the leaders in the alternative energy area, and today we're going to hear more about that. One thing that I would like to talk about is the attributes that have been given to us in the past. In the past 5 years, Ohio has been named one of the top 5 states in the United States in fuel cells. And recently, I think it was a year and a half ago, that we received that award again. And that just goes to show you how broad the industry is and how well respected it is throughout the United States. One last thing, and this is a little bit of self-promotion. We will be hosting an international national fuel cell conference in October of this year. There will be over 1,000 people. It's going to be at the convention center, and I welcome any of you to come. I think it's going to be a fantastic event. Honda is our conference chair for this event, and it is the premier fuel cell event in the United States. Our panel here that you have is going to have a dialogue on a series of topics related to fuel cells. So what we're going to do is start it out first, because if I ask the audience, and we'll do only a raise of hands, how many of you know what a fuel cell is? So I'd say that's about 50% maybe. So the other 50% has no idea, okay? So what we're going to do is inform you on what a fuel cell is and the applications, and we're going to have John do that. John?
Okay. So basically in lay terms, a fuel cell is well, I wouldn't say necessarily lay terms, but electrochemical energy converter. So if you just dissect the word electrochemical, it has an electrical and it has a chemical portion. So it takes the chemical energy that's locked in a fuel, such as natural gas, and in the presence of oxygen, typically from air, about 20% or so of what you're breathing right now is oxygen, and it combines those chemically to directly produce electricity, water, and if you're using natural gas, it also produces some CO2, okay? And another type of electrochemical energy converter, most people are very familiar with, is the common battery, okay? That is an electrochemical energy converter, but unfortunately in primary, what are called primary cells, like that you use in radios and things like this, the batteries, once the chemicals are used up, you literally have to go out and buy a new battery. The alternative, of course, is what are called secondary cells. That's lithium-ion batteries and nickel metal hydrides and things like this, or lead acid battery in your car, the chemical reaction can be reversed by simply passing electricity back into the battery in a certain fashion. So the difference between a battery electrochemical energy converter and a fuel cell electrochemical energy converter is that a fuel cell, as long as you continue to feed it fuel and oxygen, it will continuously generate electricity plus the other byproducts. So now, as far as different types of fuel cell technologies, there's a broad array of them out there. They're roughly classified into low temperature, which are like the proton exchange membrane fuel cell, and then the intermediate temperature ones, the phosphoric acid fuel cell, then the higher temperature salt oxide fuel cells. And each of these types of fuel cells are really classified based on the materials that the fuel cell is made from, okay? Typically what you see at the lower temperatures, you have to use some exotic materials, or you have to use some type of a separate device to convert the fuel to a form that the fuel cell can actually consume. So the lower temperature fuel cells typically want to see pure hydrogen. And unfortunately, pure hydrogen doesn't exist naturally. Okay, it's locked up in water, it's locked up in carbohydrates and hydrocarbons and so forth. Whereas when you go to the higher temperature fuel cells, because of the higher temperatures, some of those can use these fuels directly. They can use methane and other fuels directly. So I'll probably stop it there and let you go.
Yeah, thank you. I sometimes I'll give an easy, a simple example and say, it's just like a battery, except it never wears down. So how cool is that? Now we're going to talk about a number of different aspects that you probably saw some of the points that we're going to discuss in your flyer. And the first thing we want to talk about is the future of the grid and how fuel cells play into that. I want Ram to start with that. Ram?
Thanks, Pat. So I'm with the utility, American Electric Power, and many times we go and we talk about new technologies, people always say, well, you guys don't like new technologies, you just like the grid as it is. And I'm here to say, no, that's not true. We really do think distributed generation, which fuel cells are a form of, and solar panels are another form of it, wind generation, another form, have a part to play. We think it's an and equation. You know, you can have central generation and distributed generation, and both have parts to play. We are very excited about fuel cells as compared to solar and wind, because solar works when the sun's shining and it's not cloudy. Wind works when it's windy, so you have to have some other backup generation form, or you have to have some batteries. It makes that whole cost of the whole system much more expensive. Whereas with fuel cells, you can put it in a neighborhood, you can put it in a home even at some point in the future, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that as we go forward. And you can run it with natural gas that most people have piped to their house right now. The natural gas infrastructure already exists. Your furnace is driven off it, and you need that same low-pressure natural gas fed to your fuel cell, and it can provide electricity for your needs. Now, it could do it in a variety of methods. Consumers can go and buy one for each individual home. Some other entity could put one for neighborhoods, so like your street or your subdivision can be powered by it, or it could be used in an emergency backup situation. You have a big derecho come through Ohio, and the power from the utility gets interrupted, but then you need to go on to backup power. So there are a variety of reasons why power might be very important in different applications. And the backup power, to me, backup power is a nice to have. But to a supermarket or someone that has a lot of money invested in cooling or in keeping instruments or data centers up, that's a very important aspect. So we are looking at all these different applications, and just like John talked about, the technology is actually pretty old and it's been making a lot of progress. The critical hurdle to its large-scale deployment till now has been the cost. So the technology is well proven. You must have seen the 60-minute segment on the Bloom Energy box. People know it works. There are installations in the Northeast, there are installations in South Korea. They're very expensive today. And while it doesn't have to compete with low-cost central generation natural gas combined, it has to be cost-effective for certain applications. And we're very hopeful We watch this technology, and we're very hopeful that it will get to more cost competitive and then deployed in various applications, either on the customer side or on the utility side, to provide enhanced reliability for the grid and resiliency in the case of severe weather events.
Anybody else from the panel want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think Ram hit the nail on the head. The technology's basically there, but really the price point is not there yet to be able to compete with the current grid. And so there's a lot of aspects to the price point. Obviously is the materials that you're using, the performance of those materials, the durability of those materials, the manufacturability of those materials. So there's all of these things that have to be addressed. And then last but not least, obviously, is you have to build the infrastructure out there to not just manufacture these things, but also to install them, to maintain them, and then also to integrate them into your neighborhood or into the grid at large. So there's a lot of other things that figure into that price point.
And I should add, following up on our conversation at lunch, Pat, that Ohio is very well positioned. You mentioned materials, components, subsystems that lead to the integration of these energy conversion systems, and it turns out that the state of Ohio actually has a major role in the supply chain. Maybe you should say a word about that, Pat. You know all the details of that.
Yeah, it was interestingly enough, I was at an event in Washington, and a prominent fuel cell company had come up to me and says, Ohio had the best supply chain for fuel cells in the world. And in their opinion, it was not only cost, but it was certainly quality too. And it's a legacy of the automotive and the aerospace industry. And what we use in our advertisements is that there is not a fuel cell manufactured in the United States that does not have an Ohio component manufactured here. It's pretty exciting. So if you know, it's everything from metal plates to pumps, to valves, to gaskets, and it's just amazing. And so we really do have a prominent role in that fuel cell arena. Sometimes we don't always know who those suppliers are because there's a little bit of this in the industry, needless to say. Thank you, though. The next thing I'm going to actually add to both Ram and what John said too. Last year I was at a conference in Connecticut, the National Fuel Cell Conference that'll be in Columbus next year, and it was the same week, the day after Hurricane Sandy. And there's 65 fuel cells up and down the East Coast, and none of those fuel cells went down. Matter of fact, the location where we had the event was powered by 3 fuel cells. So that's pretty incredible that you see when issues happen like that, how a fuel cell can come into play, distributed generation again, and that keeps everything operating. Hopefully we'll never have anything not nearly as terrible as Hurricane Sandy, but that just gives you an indication. The next topic is we have a number of companies, including Honda, either developing residential fuel cells or have residential fuel cells in the market today. Yeah, I mean, you can literally buy a residential fuel cell. So if our audience, I'm going to give this to Giorgio, wanted to buy a residential fuel cell, how much would it cost? Or how much could it cost in the future? And what would be the benefit, including the return on investment? Giorgio?
So, first of all, let's take a step back. I'll pick up on the things that John so clearly explained earlier. You have this electrochemical energy conversion system, and you start from the chemical side with a fuel that is converted into electricity. But as John accurately said, there are byproducts to this conversion. CO2 is one of them, but heat is another. And so one of the things that makes a residential fuel cell, so now we're talking about something that is small. It may look like an air conditioning unit, okay, just to give you an idea, is fed by your natural gas line at home. And the first thing that you have to do is figure out how to get the hydrogen out of the natural gas. So for those of you who may remember a little bit of chemistry, natural gas is almost all methane. Methane is CH4. That's the friendliest hydrocarbon we can get, right? Only one C that you need to remove. But to free up the hydrogen that you need from the methane, you do have to go through a combustion process. You take the carbon, it combines with oxygen, it forms CO2, and then what is left over is hopefully clean enough hydrogen to go into the fuel cell. So the Japanese Tokyo Gas fuel cells that are used, actually that exist commercially in production in Japan, use the same type of polymer electrolyte membrane fuel cell that Honda may use in their automobiles. So what happens then is the process of heating up this gas to extract the hydrogen produces heat, and in an automobile, that heat would be a byproduct. Then you would use the electricity to run your electric motors. But if this box that is connected to your home generates heat, why not put this heat through a heat exchanger and heat up a liquid, for example, water? So you wouldn't need a boiler any longer, and this process of providing electric power and heat at the same time in the industry has this acronym that is used, CHP, combined heat and power. Now, the example I just gave is based on the polymer electrolyte membrane, or as John said earlier, the low temperature fuel cell. Today, there is a belief that in the future, solid oxide or high temperature fuel cells are probably going to be more cost effective in these applications. But in both cases, you end up generating both electricity and heat. And the end result is that the combined efficiency of the conversion of the chemical energy in the gas into electricity and the use of the byproduct heat to give you hot water or heating if you have radiators that run on hot water in your home, that combined efficiency ends up in the range of being 70–80% efficient, which is something that is difficult to imagine if you're used like I do, if you're used to thinking about internal combustion engines, at 30–35% efficiency. So tomorrow, there may be products for you that you could plug into your home. They would give you electricity, they would provide you with hot water, maybe heat for the home, and now I pick up on what Ram was saying about reliability and emergency power, because now you have a supply of electricity that is distinct and separate from your electric power grid, so you have a more robust electric power system in your home, and this could be a replacement for the electric power generator that some of you might have in your garages or connected to your home in some fashion. So that was my quick and dirty assessment of this, but what I would like to do now is turn it over to my right and to my left to talk a little bit about some of the challenges at the moment. It is true that in Japan some of the systems are commercially available and installed. I think that some of these things are beginning to become available in the US, but it's not. Is it something we can do today? What do you think?
So, John, I'll go first. They are commercially available today. You can buy them. They're like Pat was saying, in the Northeast. In fact, several companies are based in the Northeast. They are expensive. I talked about Bloom Energy. Bloom Energy's deployed these fuel cells in many businesses in California. In fact, I went and visited the headquarters of Adobe Software, and in their parking garage, they have 12 of these Bloom boxes providing 1/3 of the building's energy. But the state of California had a huge incentive program to allow those fuel cells to be deployed. So the technology works, but without lots and lots of incentives and subsidies, right now, the cost profile doesn't make it competitive unless you have really a very special need that you're willing to pay a premium for that power. So I think there are two parts. California shows with regulatory support, the subsidy was through the regulatory process. They were allowed to deploy these fuel cells because it was subsidized and so the cost was socialized. That's one way. The other way is the price goes down because they get scale in some part of the world that drives this cost down, because it's a chicken and egg problem. I talk to all of them and they say, Ram, if you give me an order for $1 million, I can give you a price of a very nice, reasonable price. I said, I can't give you an order for anything until you get the price down to that. So which comes first? And maybe some innovative state will say, look, we will help seed this. All these any advance in technology, any innovation required some early adopters to pay a lot of money to allow that technology to develop. And that's very true even in the energy business, I would say. And the problem with energy is it's a big, big problem. It's not a small problem. Software and IT, bits and the internet, they are, while they're very powerful, they're very easy and quick. Whereas energy, you have to have an infrastructure. You have to build that up. You have to allow manufacturing at large scale to occur. And we are waiting to see how that will play out in the future.
Yeah, I'd like to take another aspect of what Giorgio mentioned. That was this combined heat and power. People have to realize most power plants, okay, are located near a body of water, a flowing river, a lake of some sort. So therefore, typically, conventional power plants are tens or hundreds of miles away from the load. And so therefore, when they do the energy conversion process from the fuel, let's say take coal, right? You take the coal, you grind it up, you burn it, and you generate heat, thermal energy. You boil water, that water makes steam, which then turns a turbine. That turbine then spins a generator that generates electricity. So you've gone through several energy conversions. Each one of those energy conversions loses part of the original energy. So by the time you take into account all these energy conversions in typical central generation, which means tens of hundreds of miles away, you've lost probably 60–65% of the energy. And then you take the losses in the wires to get the energy from that remote power plant to your home, okay, you lose additional energy. So if you actually take a look at the Energy Information Agency, it's a DOE entity, I believe, they basically put out a report every year. And if you take a look at from primary energy, all the coal, all of the oil, natural gas, nuclear, and so forth that is consumed in the U.S. to produce electrical energy, and you take that and you take what's actually delivered to the customer, turns out the net electrical efficiency of the grid is around about 31 or 32%. So that means 68 to 69% goes to heat, which, because of the remoteness of these plants, there's really not a lot you can do with it. So as Giorgio mentioned, one of the nice things about distributed generation, the fact that now you move that generation source close to the load, not just the electrical load, but also the thermal load. And you can use that heat to generate hot water. You can use it for space heating. There's even techniques to use that for cooling, okay? So now you can jump, say, the net efficiency of a fuel cell. If you just look at the electrical side, it may be 30, 40%, something of this nature. But now when you do the combined heat and power, it pushes that up into 80+%. So.
And if I can make another comment to that, on the issue of cost, Ram brought the subject here, if you order me $1 million, it'll bring the cost down. But it turns out that it is more than just a unit cost. The size of the unit that you produce is very important. So the past few days, I've been reading a Department of Energy report that talks about cost analysis of the stationary fuel cell systems. And it turns out that producing units that will give you, for example, say 5 kilowatts, something that might be consistent with a residential home, is a lot more expensive per kilowatt of power generated than producing, say, a 100 kilowatt unit. So your department stores, grocery stores, special sort of commercial operations are much more likely to be adopters of these systems and to find them at a cost that is acceptable to them for two reasons. One is, as Ram said, they have an added value that is very important to them. And second, the production cost per kilowatt of these larger units, say 100 kilowatt range, is something that is much more affordable in the near term. So perhaps we'll go in that direction first.
We have, I get a call probably once a year, maybe more often, with a company that's interested in purchasing a fuel cell. And what usually kills the deal is, well, it's two things. California was mentioned earlier. They have a 55% tax credit for deployment purposes. The federal government has a tax credit, and then they add their tax credit onto it, and you see a whole series of fuel cells. New Jersey, and I believe maybe New York also has a tax credit. And, which we talked about somewhat, the cost of electricity, believe it or not, even though you see your bill sometimes and you wonder, is very reasonable in the state of Ohio, as opposed to the East Coast and West Coast. So that makes it sort of more of a ready market. What we could do here is have a tax credit on top of that. I don't know how realistic that is, so that would make it more feasible. But I think I just wanted to add that to some realities that we have here. Natural gas has been a topic of conversation in Ohio over the last 2 years. With our potential abundance of natural gas, how does that play into fuel cells, both in the residential and the utility scale? I know that Giorgio mentioned a little bit about natural gas and fuel cells, but let's talk about as the industry, the natural gas industry evolves and the abundance of the natural gas becomes more prominent, then what happens?
Well, I think that first of all, the thing that I have in my mind, the experts are sitting on either side of me, is from electric power generation in recent times, it has always been most cost effective for the utilities to turn to coal for their baseload generation. That seems to be, in Ohio, is probably the overwhelming majority of what is used. As if this abundance of natural gas results then in a lower price point for natural gas, there must be a threshold where for an electric utility it becomes more cost effective to produce electricity with natural gas. So can you shed some light on that for us consumers?
I can. Giorgio's absolutely right. Traditionally, until very recently, for any utility, it's always been most cost effective to run large, and we call them base load because they run all the time, coal burning power plants. The fuel that you use is coal. It's priced in terms of dollars per ton, and it's an economic dispatch system that the United States uses. The grid says, what's the cheapest available electricity? Let me take that. What's the next cheapest and the next cheapest? And you go up the stack until, and on August, on a very, very hot, normal August day, when everything and everyone wants air conditioning, every plant has to be running, then you start to dispatch even the most expensive pieces of equipment. So what's happened in the last 3 years, and we call it shale gale or dash to gas, is the United States has more gas than anybody anticipated. We probably have more than even I can or I'm even describing today. We were probably going to have more to meet all our needs and then more to export. And gas prices are at such a level now, if they're below $4 an MM, this is a quantity, $4 an MMBTU, it's actually cheaper to run gas plants. And what's happened is AEP, which has been heavily coal-based, and lots of other utilities have switched to running their gas plants constantly and shutting their coal plants, which is what you want, that the market dictates that fuel source is cheaper and available, you should do that. And that's a good thing. So central generation is moving to natural gas. What has scared utility finance and operational folks in the past is natural gas has always had very high volatility. It went up and then down, and so people ran to gas, and then gas went so high they had to shut all their gas plants and start cleaning out their coal plants to start running them. This is the first sustained period where natural gas prices have been low and stable over a long period of time. So now more and more people are making the decision to build new gas plants and shutter coal plants. Don't retrofit them. It's too expensive. Just shut them down, either completely shut them down or convert them to natural gas, or build new natural gas, because siting natural gas is much easier than a coal plant. The water requirements, the emission requirements are much better. So that takes care of the central generation side. But on the distributed generation side, the infrastructure to pipe gas largely exists everywhere there's urban populations. So the fuel cell, if it was to be bought by a consumer for their house, or like Giorgio says, for a commercial establishment, they already have natural gas. So they don't have to pay that additional cost to get the pipes delivering the gas to their house in most cases. That's a great advantage. So really, if they could reduce the cost of the unit to a reasonable level and be much, much more reliable, the fact that we have so much gas in the shale formations, the fact that the infrastructure already exists, the fact that it's cheap to burn, it'll drive us more, and it's a much cleaner burning fuel compared to coal. It'll drive us more towards using more of that natural gas. Now, Pat, when everybody jumps on natural gas and we get natural gas vehicles and natural gas 18-wheelers, will the price go up? It's a market. It probably will.
Or maybe once we start exporting it.
Right.
John?
Yeah, just from a little different perspective, you know, you think of today, electric utilities distribute electrons. So if you transition eventually to this distributed generation model, now you'll be distributing fuel, basically. And as Ron pointed out, most areas of the country, the exception being, I believe, is the Northeast, have natural gas infrastructure there today. So that transition now, obviously, you'd probably have to build more capacity into that existing system to be able to handle the load. But just saying, there's some existing infrastructure there.
Let me make another comment related to natural gas being your transmission line of the future, perhaps. One thought that occurred recently in a conversation I had with some colleagues, is someone started thinking about, well, how much natural gas is actually contained in our pipelines nationally? And if you start adding up the numbers, it turns out that the amount of energy that is stored in the pipelines is phenomenal. So it turns out that this distribution system is actually an energy storage system that accomplishes energy storage in amounts that electric utilities would be very jealous of. If, So the point is that there are a lot of virtues to natural gas, and I like this idea. I've never heard it explained this way. Instead of moving electrons, we move the fuel, and then the electrons are produced locally.
Electrons are lighter, but...
Yeah, this is true. But natural gas is not so bad, right?
We're going to have a quiz after this, too. So.
Oh, I prepared the exams to hand out. This is the danger of having a professor on the panel.
In 2 minutes, well, let's say in a couple, and at 1 o'clock, we're going to have questions and answers. So I just wanted to give everybody a heads up so you can prepare some tough answers for these guys. A couple of things, and let's see if we can cover them. One, and we have not touched on this, on the clean energy that a fuel cell is really a clean, very clean technology. So who would like to briefly talk about that?
Well, I can talk about that a little bit. First of all, as I mentioned, depends what your fuel is. If you were literally putting pure hydrogen into a fuel cell, literally the only thing that comes out is heat and water vapor, okay? Now, truth is, to be able to get to that pure hydrogen, you have to go through some type of thermal or thermochemical process or photothermochemical process. There's a whole bunch of different processes to actually obtain that hydrogen, okay? So, strictly speaking, if you had pure hydrogen, that's really what the emissions would just be water vapor. So, but normally you'd have to use some other source, for instance, natural gas. But in that reformation process where you take in natural gas, convert it to hydrogen, you can't get rid of the carbon. The carbon still comes out. So it comes out in the form of CO2, and there are different things you could use the CO2 for gas well injection and some of these other kinds of concepts to force more oil out of the ground and things of this nature.
But conceptually, the CO2 that you produce in reforming for a fuel cell is the same amount of CO2 per mass of fuel consumed that you would produce in a large power plant, right? There is no difference because you're combusting the fuel. So.
And to add to that, it's a clean form of CO2 that can be it doesn't have to be cleaned up because it's got sulfur dioxide and nitrous dioxide. Sure. There's a whole, coal has everything in the periodic table in it. So you have to take it all out because the atmosphere doesn't like it.
Yeah. It's interestingly enough, when the Ohio's Fuel Cell Initiative was started, we weren't really thinking about the clean part of it, but as years go on, especially with restrictions for power plants and everything else, we start to becoming more attractive in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, just to mention too, there are fuel cells that actually run on coal too. And are some of the highest efficiency fuel cells probably will run on actual pure carbon. The downside is these are test tube experiments at this point in time, so the technology really isn't developed much.
So we have one last point to cover, and let's look into the future. We'll have our crystal balls out in, let's say, 10 or 15 years. So what will the state of Ohio's economic impact as the result of the deployment of fuel cells look like, including the supply chain, manufacturing, energy costs, and the evolution of the technology? That's pretty broad, and I don't know how we're going to do that in 5 minutes, but you guys can do it, I'm sure.
Thanks for
The
letting me
resident economist.
So we can, in fact, we have a strategic relationship with LG Fuel Cell Systems, which is based in Canton, Ohio. They used to be called Rolls-Royce Fuel Cell Systems, and LG from Korea bought a substantial portion, and now they're called, and we work with them closely. We've tested them. They partner with we've got a large testing facility in Groveport, Ohio, that we've tested their fuel cells. They've got a roadmap to get to the price points and the size and the capacity and capabilities that we think are very interested from a utility standpoint. And I've said, and I hope I made that point, is to us it's another tool in our toolbox. It's not this or this. It's just another very valuable and useful tool in our toolbox that we would love to have and deploy, but we are forced to be very judicious and prudent with our cost expenses. So we will want to see that cost come down to, it doesn't have to come down to what the grid is today, but it has to come close enough that it can get legs and move. So from the economic and the deployment standpoint, I look at that as a few years out, and since there's lots of work in Ohio, hopefully that'll result in more orders for them and more units be produced in the state of Ohio.
And to pick up on your point about the supply chain, there is a lot of activity in the high temperature solid oxide fuel cells as well as in the PEM fuel cells that involves organizations like Battelle, Nextech, GrafTech, and the list of companies that is involved in this subject area is large. And one of the potential outcomes looking to the future is that maybe system integrators might want to take advantage of the availability of this expertise and supply chain here to actually establish the manufacturing and assembly of complete systems here in Ohio. To me, it makes a lot of sense, but I'm not the investor, so.
I just want to add a little fuel for thought. If you take a look at the number of automobiles manufactured and sold in the U.S. per year, and you attribute, say, roughly 100 kilowatt generation capacity to a fuel cell, and you could say, argue it's a little more, it's a little less, whatever. And basically what you'll see is that if you take that number of cars, multiply it by 100 kilowatts per car on average, okay, literally the base generation of the existing electrical system is duplicated in automobiles once every 2 years. Back prior to 2008 was done every year, but auto sales gone down considerably. So you say, how quickly could you transition to this future of a truly distributed generation model? It literally could be done, assuming that the technology was in place, it could be done pretty rapidly. And then you say, well, how could you use an automobile? Well, the way you could use an automobile, you drive to work, you park it in the garage, it connects up electrically and fuel-wise and exhaust-wise to the building, and you supply electricity and heat to the building. You drive home at night, you pull it in your garage, and you basically supply your house and possibly 3 or 4 houses around you. In fact, I did a calculation one time just looking at the number of cars parked in the AP garage, and if you assumed a 50 kilowatt fuel cell for each one of those cars, okay, and you assume a 30% availability, or 30% of the people actually participate in this, you could not only handle the base load of the AEP building, okay, that way I guess, whichever way it is, you could handle 5 buildings that size, a similar size, just off the automobiles. Now obviously an auto fuel cell is not really optimized for continuous use, but there's ways to work around that technically as well. So that's just some food for thought for the future.
I'm gonna end this with I'm gonna create a market, okay? And this is an example. And I'll throw the number out. Are we gonna have 10,000 gas wells in eastern Ohio? I think that's probably a very conservative number. We could probably double, triple that, quadruple that if we look at West Virginia and Pennsylvania. So Giorgio's residential fuel cell, it's on the market. And I'm going to go to the AEP and say, since you're going to help us with the purchase of this natural gas, and say, hey, listen, let's negotiate and give me free natural gas. They already get it for heat for their home, correct, a lot of times, oftentimes, and hot water. So if we can get it for free electricity or free natural gas for the fuel cell, now I have free electricity. So that's a heck of a market. I don't know, AEP may not like that.
I'll have to think about that.
Anyway, thank you. Now for questions.
Hi, David Chesbrough, President at COSI. I've got about 20 questions, so Ram and John, we'll have to talk afterwards, and Giorgio, because actually, Giorgio, you've had some great conversations before, which I can stimulate this, looking at systems rather than individual things. If you forget the hydrogen in the ground here, if you want to look at a systems approach to using hydrogen, you really optimize the clarity of our environment by actually taking you mentioned the sun and the wind. I mean, somewhere along the line here, we've all seen the classic experiments where you run electricity through water and you come up with hydrogen and oxygen. None of you touched on that, and I don't know if that's just such a far-flung idea, or is it just simply because we have so much natural gas here that kind of forces us into thinking about that as a fuel source. So that's part A. Part B is you've also mentioned a fair number of fancy named chemicals, some of which I might suspicion are probably rare metals. And we're already in a rare metal circumstance with the demand on rare metals for all of our electronics. And are we getting ourselves further into trouble as we look at fuel cells and some of the chemicals that are going to be required for some of the processes that we have now? So either one, both.
Yeah, I'll start with the electrolysis thing because, in fact, what we're doing at the Center for Automotive Research, our new upgraded hydrogen refueling station that we're going to use for this fuel cell bus demonstration program will be, the hydrogen will be produced by electrolysis as a matter of convenience. It's easier for the volumes we are going to produce, and we're not so interested. Cost is not our primary constraint. But from an energy efficiency perspective, you've already, as John explained so well earlier, you've already gone through all these steps of producing electricity and losing energy every step of the way. If you now make that electricity to produce hydrogen, that hydrogen is very expensive from an energy perspective. And actually, ultimately, you may have used a lot of coal to make the hydrogen. Of course, in an ideal world, in this romantic view of a solar wind world, you could make free electricity that is completely carbon-free, but we're pretty far from that today. So that's on the subject of electrolysis. So today, the reason why compressed natural gas is the primary source of hydrogen is simply because it's the most cost-effective way of doing it. Okay. Now, your second question was?
The rare metals.
The rare metals, okay.
Yeah, in the rare metals area, basically, as I mentioned, at the lower temperature fuel cells, the lower temperature to the intermediate temperatures, typically where you need those materials. As you go to the higher and higher temperatures, like solid oxide fuel cells, the requirement is virtually non-existent, very, very attainable. And even at the lower temperature fuel cells, I mean, in the probably 20 years I've followed PEM fuel cells, they've been constantly trying to engineer those expensive materials out, use them as nanoparticles and things like this to be able to make them more effective, because really catalyst only operates on the surface of the particle, so the bulk doesn't do anything for you. So it's better to say have a big chunk of platinum sitting there to break it up into a bunch of little tiny particles and disperse it on some type of a substrate. So again, the trend is to go away from, engineer as much of those materials out as possible, develop new catalysts with less expensive materials, and then go to use temperature as your friend as you go to higher and higher temperatures.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Ken Thompson. I'm an architect, and a couple questions come to mind pretty quickly. Out west, real problem with water supply. Can the water that is generated through this process, could you use salt water to use in the process and end up with drinkable water as a byproduct? And then secondly, so you've got these primary users like a big building that's got backup generators. Those are huge, typically big diesel generators that kick on when the rest of the power's off. Your fuel cells as backups, is the cost of those, the cost of not having a generator, worked into the equation of the cost of having the fuel cell to provide that backup?
Well, first of all, on the waterfront, even on the space shuttle, I believe the fuel cell is used as a water source. Now, obviously, they've have pure hydrogen and oxygen to react in their fuel cell. Now, to go from something like salt water to, again, the fuel cell is producing that. So if you wanted to have some type of closed cycle where you pull in salt water and you have to remove the salinity from it, and then to now split the water molecule to be able to get the hydrogen out, run it through a fuel cell, throw hydrogen one way, oxygen the other way. Again, this is very energy intensive to do all that. So I don't.
And typically, I would say that in one of these self-contained combined heat and power systems, you tend to have a closed cycle for the water. So whatever you need for your various heat exchange is actually produced by the fuel cell itself. So it tends to be, the water tends to stay within.
Yeah. But there is the idea that, again, going back to my automobile idea, when you're in a remote area, you're getting heat from this, you're getting electricity from it, you're getting water from it. In fact, I think the Saudis and others have made considerable investments in fuel cells because of that, okay, where they think that then, they could use it in that fashion.
On the generator side, certainly in cost analysis, I have seen to justify investments in producing residential type fuel cells or commercial establishment or for commercial applications, the avoided cost of your generator for emergency generator is part of the economic picture. It makes sense to think about it that way. Unfortunately, today fuel cells are still a little bit more expensive than those little Honda gensets. Okay.
Hello, my name is John McKnight, and I work for Rife's Auto Body. And first of all, I just want to say I'm kind of proud of myself for being able to keep up with you guys. There's just a whole mess of brain power sitting up there on the stage. So I work in the automotive industry, and so naturally I'm wondering, how likely is it that in the foreseeable future we'll see this kind of technology used to power vehicles, and how safe is the technology when considering using it for powering vehicles? Compressed natural gas and some other things that can power vehicles, there's concerns about safety and resulting from an accident, a collision that could, cause an explosion of the fuel or something.
Yeah, so today fuel cell vehicles are at a pretty mature stage of demonstration. So I don't believe that there is actually a product you can buy in a showroom, but all major auto companies have substantial demonstration programs, and you won't be surprised to hear that the largest concentration of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles is in the state of California, where in fact they're working actively, and I think they're almost there, with enabling the Sacramento to San Diego corridor to actually have hydrogen refueling so that you could conceivably drive up and down the state of California in a hydrogen fuel cell car. About a year ago I was there visiting the University of California at Irvine, and I drove a Toyota fuel cell powered vehicle, and I actually refueled it at a public refueling station. So the technology is there, and all the safety issues that of course are important have been addressed by the automotive industry. The problem is not safety, it's cost. So the fuel storage for a hydrogen is typically they're going now to 10,000 PSI tanks that are typically made of aluminum and wrapped in carbon fiber, and so you have to do all the crash testing of the vehicles, of the prototype. Those are expensive crash tests, by the way, so you have a $500,000 car that you crash to determine that it's safe. So safety is really not an issue in the sense that the industry understands how to handle it, but I think it's a long time before we will see showroom fuel cell vehicles, but I'm not ruling it out. We'll see what comes in the future.
I'll give you a little bit different aspect on that. Number one, infrastructure is the biggest issue. I think Honda's already driven their fuel cell vehicle 150,000 miles with pretty good results. And Giorgio said earlier, 300-mile range, 3 to 5 minutes to refuel. What don't you like? What can't you like about that? Infrastructure is a huge issue. If you didn't see it recently, Honda and General Motors have agreed to a development agreement, which we thought was huge. You know, General Motors and biggest, the most progressive domestic, and Honda have agreed to work together on a new fuel cell vehicle by 2020. But Honda is also saying by 2015 they will have a new Honda version of their fuel cell car in the market. I don't know what that means at this point because it's the infrastructure issue. And if you come to the conference in the fall of the year, you can drive a Honda or a Toyota and go drive around the block. Seriously, there'll be ride and drive at that conference.
When do you think we'll see solid oxide vehicles, fuel cells in vehicles like buses and trucks and things like that?
I think the only program that I know of is related to solid oxide fuel cell APUs, auxiliary power units for trucks. And I am not, to be honest with you, I am not sure how close they are to any kind of commercial production. Maybe Paul George knows, but.
I probably know more than I can say.
Okay. Got you in trouble in no time.
I'll add to that, it's a shock and vibration thing on the solid oxide too, which it's a little bit more difficult to absorb. That's why they're perfect for stationary applications.
Once more, please thank our sponsors, AEP, Battelle, Columbia Gas, Porter Wright, and our partner, the OSU Office of Energy and Environment. Also, our speakers, Ram Sastry, Giorgio Rozzoni, John Schneider, and our moderator, Pat Valente. Thank you very much, gentlemen.